Chapter 1. The Music That Vanished. The last notes of the violin faded into the hush of the drawing-room, like a whisper carried off by the wind. A second of reverent silence hung in the air, until Lady Deverell rose and clapped her hands with almost theatrical fervour. "Magnificent! Simply magnificent, my dear Sandrine! I dare say even Paganini would have wept." The young woman at the grand piano flushed. "It wasn't me, Lady Deverell. It was all Felix." Felix Montrose, the celebrated violinist, gave a modest bow from where he stood beside the fire, his Stradivarius tucked gently under his arm. He was slender and pale, with a mop of dark curls and a distant gaze that spoke of artistic torment or genius, or both. Poirot, who was seated in a high-backed armchair with his legs perfectly crossed, tilted his head and allowed himself a small smile. "Formidable," he said softly, his accent curling around the word. "The control, the phrasing, such elegance." "You're very kind," Felix said, though his voice sounded distracted, almost reluctant. "I only hope it was true to Maestro d'Aubigny's composition." From across the room, Lord Deverell snorted into his brandy. "D'Aubigny? I thought you'd written it yourself. Damned if I can tell one fiddler from the next. No offence, Montrose." "None taken," Felix murmured, returning the bow to its case like a priest placing relics in a shrine. It was an odd gathering, Hercule Poirot reflected, even by his wide-ranging standards. He had been invited to Deverell Hall under the pretext of a weekend of cultured retreat, organised by the eccentric Lady Deverell herself, an amateur patron of the arts, with an eye for talent and a flair for dramatics. The sprawling country estate was nestled in the hills of Sussex, its ivy-covered facade and draughty halls evoking both charm and quiet decay. The guest list was eclectic. Felix Montrose, the world-renowned violinist, shy and withdrawn. Sandrine Vale, his accompanist and protégé, striking in her composure despite her youth. Lord and Lady Deverell, aristocratic but unconventional hosts, and a few scattered others. Basil Brandt, a music critic with a sharp tongue and sharper eyebrows. Dr. Lena Harrington, a composer of avant-garde opera. And Elric Coombs, the Deverell's personal solicitor, and an amateur cellist of middling skill and great enthusiasm. Poirot and Captain Hastings had arrived that afternoon, having been persuaded by Lady Deverell's glowing invitation, which promised a weekend of musical brilliance, stimulating minds, and perhaps even a little mystery. Hastings had scoffed at that, but Poirot had raised one elegant eyebrow and packed his valise with unusual care. Now, as the applause faded and the guests drifted toward drinks and conversation, Poirot turned to Hastings, who stood nursing a scotch near the fireplace. "Well?" Poirot asked. "Well, what? You are silent, mon ami. Normally, after such a performance, you express your feelings quite freely, whether or not the feelings are musically informed." Hastings chuckled. "I admit I rather enjoyed it. Not that I know a tremolo from a turn, but that violin of his, it's something else." "It is," Poirot agreed. "A Stradivarius, very rare, very valuable. But it is not the violin itself that intrigues me." "No?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "No, it is the man who plays it. Monsieur Montrose has the fingers of an artist, but the eyes of a man haunted. Did you see the way he looked at the bow as he played? Almost as if it might betray him." Hastings glanced toward the young musician, who now sat alone, a glass of wine untouched beside him, staring into the fireplace with an air of melancholy detachment. "Seems a bit moody, that's all. Artists often are. Perhaps," Poirot said, steepling his fingers. "Or perhaps the music he plays is not the only thing he wishes to keep silent." Just then, Lady Deverell returned to the room, flanked by Basil Brant and Dr. Harrington, who were deep in a debate about 12-tone technique. "My dears," she called out, "let us retire to the music room. Sandrine has promised a second recital, something from her own repertoire this time, and I believe a nightcap is in order." "No," the guests murmured assent and began to drift toward the music room. Hastings tugged Poirot's sleeve. "Coming?" Poirot rose with a small sigh. "Mais oui. The evening is still young, and who knows what notes it may yet strike." The music room at Deverell Hall was as lavish as it was peculiar. Deep burgundy, drapes framed leaded windows, and oil portraits of Deverell ancestors watched from the walls with disapproval or boredom. A harp stood neglected in one corner. In the centre of the room sat a glossy black Steinway, and beside it an empty stand where Felix had earlier played. Sandrine took her seat at the piano, and after a moment's preparation began to play. Her composition was light, full of dancing arpeggios and sudden changes of tempo. Hastings was entranced. Poirot, however, watched the audience as much as the performance. Felix had not returned with the others. Lady Deverell noticed too. "Where's Felix?" she asked no one in particular. Surely he wouldn't miss Sandrine's performance? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps he stepped outside for air. But as the piece ended to polite applause, and Felix still did not appear, a faint ripple of unease spread through the gathering. Lady Deverell glanced at her husband, who merely shrugged and poured himself another drink. Sandrine stood from the piano, suddenly pale. "I'll go find him," she said quickly. "He's probably in the drawing-room." Poirot, however, had already turned and left the music-room. It was Hastings who found him. He was in the drawing-room, as suspected, but not seated in his usual place. Instead, Felix Montrose lay sprawled beside the hearth, his head twisted at a cruel angle, his violin case flung open beside him. There was no blood, no broken glass, only the dead hush of a room that had once been filled with music. Poirot arrived, moments later, his gaze sweeping over the scene with brisk efficiency. He knelt beside the body, fingers pressed gently to Felix's neck. Then he opened the violin case and frowned. "The Stradivarius," he said quietly. "It's gone?" Hastings asked, peering inside. "Oui." Poirot rose, his expression grim. "The violin, the precious instrument with a history spanning centuries, it has vanished." Lady Deverell appeared in the doorway and let out a strangled cry. "No! Oh, God! Felix!" Poirot turned to her, his voice steady but solemn. "Madam, I regret to inform you that Monsieur Montrose is dead, and I fear this is no accident. The music has stopped, and the silence it leaves behind is most unnatural." Hastings swallowed. "You think someone killed him? For the violin?" Poirot looked back at the empty case, then at the still form of the man who had once brought it to life. "Perhaps Hastings, but I suspect the motive lies deeper than greed. This was not only a theft, it was a message." He turned, his eyes gleaming with focus. and Hercule Poirot shall discover its meaning. Chapter 2. A House of Echoes. The snow outside Deverell Hall had grown heavier overnight, falling in thick, soundless drifts that blanketed the hedges and obscured the paths. Inside, the air was brittle with tension. Poirot had spent the early hours pacing the long upstairs corridor, occasionally peering out of a frosted window or inspecting a doorknob with his pocket magnifying glass. Hastings followed behind, bleary-eyed but loyal. "Poirot," Hastings muttered, stifling a yawn. "Don't you think we ought to sleep before interrogating every banister?" Poirot didn't smile. "Non, mon ami. Murder waits for no man's rest, and in a house such as this, where the rooms are vast and the shadows deeper still, it is in the quietest corners that truth hides." Downstairs, the drawing-room had become something of a command post. Inspector Grange was organising a search of the property while his constables took statements. Each guest had been instructed to remain inside. No exceptions. Lady Deverell swept in, her expression grim but composed, her white wool robe cinched tightly. "I've instructed the staff to assist you, Inspector, though I doubt they can be of much use." Poirot glanced up from his notes. "You do not believe the staff are involved, madam?" "Good heavens, no," she replied coolly. "They're loyal. Most of them have been with us for years." "Even the gardener?" Hastings asked. "What was his name?" "Albie." Lady Deverell paused just for a breath. "Albie Withers. He's worked the grounds for decades, practically a fixture." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet, it is fixtures that are most often overlooked." She gave him a sharp look. "Meaning?" "Only that what is long familiar becomes invisible, even to the cleverest of observers." Lady Deverell didn't respond. She turned and left, with the quiet rustle of silk. By mid-morning, the interviews resumed. Poirot began with Basil Bront, the music critic. The man sat in the conservatory, with his coat still on, a scarf draped around his neck like a theatrical noose. "Mr. Brant," Poirot said as he joined him, "you reviewed Monsieur Montrose many times, no?" "Yes," Brant replied, crossing his arms. "He never appreciated my candour." "Did he resent you?" "I expect so. Felix had that tortured genius temperament. Brilliant, but thin-skinned." "And what of your last meeting?" Brant's mouth twisted. "I tried to be civil, but we disagreed on the direction of modern music. He thought it should return to formality, structure. I said he was becoming a relic." Poirot leaned forward. "Did he threaten you?" "No," Brant admitted. "But he told me I didn't understand his work, that I was deaf to what mattered." "A bold accusation!" Brant gave a hollow laugh. Coming from him, it was practically affectionate. Poirot studied him carefully. "Do you play the violin, Monsieur Brant?" "God, no. I leave that to the tortured." Later, Poirot sought out Elric Coombes, who stood by the library window, arms folded as he stared at the snowy landscape. "May I join you, monsieur?" Poirot asked. Coombes gave a stiff nod. "If you must." "I'm curious," Poirot began. "How well did you know Felix Montrose?" "Barely. I saw him at events mostly. We weren't friends. But you once performed with him." Coombes raised an eyebrow. "Yes, at Lady Deverell's insistence. I'm a tolerable amateur." Poirot smiled. "Did Monsieur Montrose strike you as a man under pressure?" "Always," Coombes said. He was obsessive, spoke little, except about music. That he spoke of like a zealot. And did he confide in you? Legal matters, perhaps? Not a word. I don't think he trusted many people. Poirot nodded. And did he speak of anything troubling him recently? Coombes hesitated. He mentioned a letter, one that had disturbed him, said it had come anonymously. Poirot's brows lifted. You saw this letter? No, just heard him mention it. He was unsettled by it. Poirot made a note. Thank you. That is most helpful. Hastings found Poirot again in the hallway, scribbling in his little notebook. What do you make of it, Poirot? All these conversations, anything stand out? Poirot tapped his pencil against his chin. Oui, several things, in fact, but, above all, I am intrigued by what is not being said. Such as? Poirot looked toward the staircase. Felix Montrose was afraid, not merely of a threat, but of exposure. There was something he hid, and that violin, the Stradivarius, it was the key. You still think the violin was stolen to hide a motive? I do, and I think that if we find it, we will find not only the killer's identity, but the truth Felix sought to suppress. They descended into the basement levels of Deverell Hall, where the household storage rooms lay. The scent of old wood, dust, and mildew clung to the narrow corridors. Poirot passed racks of preserved fruit, crates of wine, and a tall armoire full of antique costumes. "Have you noticed, Hastings," he said quietly, "how no one seems to have heard anything?" Hastings nodded. "Yes, even though the murder happened just rooms away from the music performance. Which suggests," Poirot said, "either remarkable timing or remarkable knowledge of the house's acoustics." They reached the wine cellar. Poirot paused near a storage cabinet and opened it. Just linens, no sign of the missing violin. Still, he examined the floor. "Dust," he murmured. "Undisturbed. The violin is not here." A noise from above interrupted their search. Voices raised in alarm. Poirot and Hastings rushed up the stairs, following the sounds to the second-floor corridor. In Sandrine Vale's room, the young violinist stood beside her overturned trunk. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled. I only went to wash my hands," she stammered. "When I returned, my things had been searched." Hastings examined the room. Clothes lay scattered on the floor. Sheet music had been rifled through. A drawer had been pulled out and dumped. Poirot stepped inside. "Mademoiselle, was anything taken?" "I don't know," she said, flustered. Wait." She moved to her writing desk and opened a drawer. Then her face fell. There was a letter from Felix, a personal one. "It's gone." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A love letter?" She hesitated. "No, a warning." "A warning?" She nodded, voice barely a whisper. "He said he had discovered something dangerous, and if anything happened to him, he wanted me to remember the word verdigris." Poirot froze. "Verdigris?" She nodded again. Poirot turned to Hastings, his voice low and urgent. "The green patina that forms on copper. It has a symbolic meaning, corruption beneath beauty. Do you think it's a clue? I do. And a rather poetic one. Someone among us is not what they appear." Later that evening, Poirot stood, once more in the grand hallway, eyes sweeping the portraits on the wall. The storm outside had worsened. Snow battered the windows. The house, for all its luxury, felt like a trap. "I must ask myself," Poirot murmured to himself, "not who had a reason to kill Felix Montrose, but who had a reason to silence him. What secret lies within these walls?" He stared again at the painting of the garden maze. Its twisting paths mirrored the mystery unravelling before him. Somewhere in those turns, in that chill silence, he felt the answer was waiting, not in violence, not in vengeance, but in something long buried. He turned away. Tomorrow he would walk the garden paths, and he would listen, not to the notes of a violin, but to the silence it left behind. Chapter 3. The Garden Maze. The next morning brought a stillness over Deverell Hall so absolute that even the birds seemed to withhold their song. A fresh blanket of snow shimmered in the garden, untouched but for the narrow path trodden by Poirot himself. He had risen early, bundled himself in his thickest coat, and now stood at the edge of the famed garden maze. Behind him, Hastings shuffled his scarf more tightly around his neck. "I say, Poirot," he muttered, "isn't it a bit early for a garden stroll, especially in this weather?" Poirot did not reply at once. He observed the entrance to the hedge maze with narrowed eyes. "This, mon ami," he said at last, "is not merely a stroll. It is a descent into memory. I believe the answer lies here." The answer to what? To what frightened Felix Montrose? To what he meant by verdigris? You recall Sandrine. Vale said he left her that word. "I do." Hastings nodded. "And you think it refers to the garden?" Poirot stepped inside the first turn of the maze. "I think it refers to something decaying, something long hidden, masked by beauty, like the green corrosion that forms on bronze." Hastings hesitated, then followed. The hedges were thick with frost, arching over them like silent witnesses. Their steps crunched as they moved deeper into the labyrinth. The garden maze was old, Edwardian in style, planted when the Deverell estate had hosted society galas and moonlit musical evenings. Now it was forgotten by all but the most curious, a relic. As they moved forward, Hastings spoke again. "You think Montrose had been here recently?" Poirot gave a small nod. "He left the concert midway, did he not? He was gone some 15 minutes before he returned, time enough for a short walk. But why come here? Perhaps because he was hiding something." They turned another corner, reaching a circular clearing at the heart of the maze. At its centre stood a crumbling stone pedestal, once adorned with a sundial. The metal plate had long since vanished. Poirot stepped toward it. "Observe," he said softly. "The base is discoloured, greenish, verdigris." "Good heavens," Hastings murmured. "Do you think he left something here?" Poirot knelt beside the pedestal and removed a small brush from his pocket. Carefully, he dusted snow from the cracks at its base. "Regardez! There is a loose stone." He pried it gently free, revealing a hollow space within. Reaching inside, he pulled out a small oilskin packet, sealed with wax and tied with string. Hastings gasped. "Is that what Montrose hid?" Poirot did not answer. He stood examining the seal. Then, delicately, he broke it and unfolded the oilskin. Inside were several folded sheets of music, handwritten, yellowing, but legible. At the bottom of the final sheet was a signature, Felix Montrose. Hastings read aloud. But the date is 1911? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Far too early for Montrose to have composed it. He would have been an infant. They returned to the warmth of the drawing-room. Poirot laid the sheets carefully upon the table. Lady Deverell, summoned from upstairs, arrived moments later with Lord Deverell in tow. "What is this about?" she asked sharply. Poirot gestured toward the music. "Madame, do you recognize this?" Lady Deverell glanced down, then paled. "That's impossible. You do recognize it." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it's my grandfather's composition, Augustin Grenfell. He wrote it in secret during the last years of his life. It was never published. Only a few family members knew it existed." Poirot tapped the signature. "And yet, here it bears the name of Felix Montrose." Lord Deverell frowned. "Montrose? He mentioned once he was researching rare works. Said he had a particular interest in Grenfell's forgotten pieces." Lady Deverell sank into a chair. "I thought it was harmless curiosity." "But it was not," Poirot said. "He found this score, and rather than reveal it belonged to Grenfell, he signed it as his own, a fraud." There was silence in the room. "Montrose," Poirot continued, "had likely intended to pass this work off as his grand final opus, perhaps even perform it publicly. But something changed. He grew afraid." "Afraid of being discovered," Hastings murmured. "We, and someone here, discovered the truth." As the morning wore on, Poirot requested another private word with Sandrine Vale. They met again in the music-room, where the scent of polish and old parchment still lingered. "I believe you knew about the music," he said gently. She hesitated. "I suspected." "Because you had heard it before?" She nodded. "Years ago, Lady Deverell played it on the piano. I didn't know the full piece, just a few bars. But when Felix showed me his new composition 2 nights ago, I recognized the theme." "And did you confront him?" "No, I didn't know what to say. He seemed proud of it, but also tormented. I think he knew he had gone too far." Poirot folded his hands. "And you are sure the letter he sent you, the one that was stolen, referenced this?" "He said he would come clean, that he couldn't live with the deceit, that someone else already knew, and had threatened him." Poirot was quiet for a long moment. "Mademoiselle Vale, did you love him?" Her eyes welled up. "I did. Even now, I think I still do." He rose gently. "Thank you. You have told me all I needed to know." By noon, Poirot had reassembled the key guests in the great hall. The Deverells, Sandrine, Basil Brant, and Elric Coombs. The hearth crackled as they gathered, expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. "I have called you here," Poirot said, "because I believe the murder of Felix Montrose has nothing to do with passion or vengeance. It is rather about theft, not of an object, but of an identity." He turned toward Lady Deverell. "Your grandfather's work was beautiful. Montrose intended to take credit for it. But someone who loved that music, who knew it intimately, could not abide the deception." Poirot walked slowly. "And so, confronted with Montrose's fraud, they acted." You're suggesting someone killed him because of a composition? Basil Brandt scoffed. Not merely a composition, Poirot said, eyes narrowing, but a legacy, a reputation, and a betrayal. He turned to face them all. The killer is among you, and they have left behind more than footprints in the snow. Lady Deverell's hand flew to her mouth. But do not fear, Poirot said, quietly. The truth is almost within reach. Chapter 4. The footprints in the snow, though the grand hall of Deverell Hall was filled with people. Silence reigned. Poirot's last statement hovered in the air like fog. The killer is among you. No one moved, no one spoke. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner offered sound, its rhythm steady, unyielding. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and paced before the hearth. Hastings stood to the side, eyes flicking from face to face. "You will forgive me," Poirot said, his voice gentle, "if I apply the methods of theatrical suspense. But murder is not a parlour game, no matter how it may appear in this charming setting." Basil Brandt scoffed. "I hardly think this qualifies as charming any more, Monsieur Poirot." The detective bowed his head slightly. "Indeed, death has no sense of decor." Poirot turned to Hastings. "You remember, mon ami, what I told you about footprints?" "Of course," Hastings replied. "There was only one set leading away, from the conservatory. Montrose's." "Precisely." Poirot addressed the others now. "There were no other footprints in the snow, and yet we know he died minutes after leaving the house." Lord Deverell frowned. "Are you suggesting he killed himself?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "No, my lord. But it is interesting, is it not, that no one followed him? Or rather, no one left evidence of following him." Lady Deverell looked, puzzled. "But how is that possible?" "There are three possibilities," Poirot said. "1. The killer followed him from inside the house, leaving through a passage that does not open to the outside. An unlikely prospect, as no such route exists to the conservatory. 2. The killer was already waiting for him in the conservatory or outside it. Or 3. He paused. The killer followed him and carefully obscured their prints. "You mean they erased them?" Sandrine Vale asked, incredulous. Poirot smiled faintly. "With a broom or a branch, or perhaps most cleverly, by stepping in Montrose's own prints on the way to the scene, then retracing their steps along the same path after the deed was done." A hush fell over the room. "Clever, yes," Poirot continued, "but not infallible. Even the most careful killer cannot walk in the exact imprint of another without betraying a subtle doubling or variation, especially when the snow is fresh and the light is right." Hastings cleared his throat. "So, did you notice such variations?" Poirot turned to him, and a slow smile crept across his face. "Ah, Hastings, you wound me. Of course I noticed. There were slight imperfections. In one set of prints, the ones leading away, there was a deeper indentation on the left heel. Just so, he illustrated with a little dip of his hand. Someone heavier than Montrose, or someone wearing different shoes," Poirot said. "You see, the killer intended to confuse. They stepped in his path, going out and returning, hoping we would not detect it. But we did." Poirot looked pointedly at one guest. "Isn't that right, Mr. Coombs?" Elric Coombs, startled. What? You were wearing boots when you arrived last night, but this morning I noticed a pair of smaller, flatter shoes, drying near the servant's entry. Yours, I believe. A rather poor attempt to disguise the wear. Coombs flushed red. I went out early this morning, just a walk. A walk to inspect your handiwork, perhaps? Poirot asked softly. Lady Deverell stood abruptly. Elric, is this true? I didn't kill him, Coombs barked. I didn't even see Montrose that night. Poirot raised a hand for calm. Let us return then to motive. You were Montrose's agent once, were you not? Yes, Coombs admitted, his voice tight. And he dismissed you, replaced you. Why? Coombs swallowed. He said I lacked vision, that I didn't understand where he was going musically. He humiliated me publicly. Poirot nodded slowly. And so you came to Deverell Hall, not merely to hear him play, but perhaps to confront him? No, I wanted to prove he'd stolen the music. I knew it wasn't his. I recognized Grenfell's style. Subtle signatures no plagiarist could imitate perfectly. I planned to expose him. But not to kill him. No, Coombs cried. He was already spiralling. I thought I could shame him into withdrawing. Poirot was silent for a moment. So, you admit you followed him into the conservatory? Coombs hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, but I left him alive, I swear it. Hastings frowned. That means someone else must have come afterward. Just so, Poirot said, which brings us to a more subtle matter, the violin. The silent violin, Lady Deverell murmured. Exactly, Poirot said. Felix Montrose's Stradivarius, the very symbol of his genius. But when we found his body, the violin was gone. Stolen? Lord Deverell asked. Perhaps. But why? It would be impossible to sell. Such an instrument is too well known. No thief would risk it unless they wanted it, Sandrine said slowly. For themselves. Poirot nodded. Indeed. We are speaking not of greed, but of obsession. A desire to possess something beautiful, something unattainable. The room grew still once more. Poirot turned his gaze upon Basil Brant. Mr. Brant, you are a collector, are you not, of rare instruments? Brant blinked. Yes, but you once offered Montrose a staggering sum for his violin. He refused. Brant's jaw tightened. He was a fool. You called him that to his face, Poirot said. In Paris, in front of witnesses. He didn't deserve that instrument, Brant snapped. He didn't respect it. He dragged it through pedestrian compositions and meaningless performances. It should have been in a museum. In your museum, Poirot said. Brant said nothing. Poirot stepped closer. You arrived here under the guise of reconciliation, but your resentment ran deep. You knew about the Grenfell forgery. You knew Montrose would be disgraced. Brant's mouth twitched. I didn't kill him. Yet the violin is gone. I don't have it. Permit us, then, to search your luggage. Brant stiffened. You have no right. I believe the police will have sufficient cause when they arrive. Brant glared at him. He was already dead when I found him, I thought. He didn't deserve to take that violin to the grave. That's all. A gasp escaped from Lady Deverell. You stole it? I recovered it, Brant said stiffly. Recovered a treasure from someone who didn't deserve it. Poirot shook his head. You and Coombs both followed Montrose into the conservatory. One of you returned alone. "And the other?" Hastings asked. Poirot paused. Perhaps never truly left. He turned slowly toward the hearth, where a very faint smear of ash stained the edge of the brickwork. "Felix Montrose," he said, "hid the original Grenfell score in the garden, yes, but he made a copy, and that copy was destroyed here." In the fire, Poirot reached down and retrieved a small scrap from the ashes, scorched parchment, a fragment of musical notation. A last attempt to cover his tracks. But someone found the original, someone who understood the betrayal, and couldn't forgive it. He looked around the room. "I now know who killed Felix Montrose. Tomorrow I will prove it beyond doubt." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving a stunned room behind. Chapter 5. Secrets Among the Ivy Morning. At Deverell Hall arrived with a muted hush, snowflakes tumbling in lazy spirals past the frost-glazed windows. The world outside was muffled, as though holding its breath. Inside, however, Poirot was already wide awake and at work. Hastings, less enthusiastically, sat on the edge of the window-seat, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. "You really believe you know who killed Montrose?" Hastings asked, rubbing his eyes. Poirot adjusted the folds of his pocket square and smiled. "Mais oui. The pieces are all in place. Now, we must simply fit them together with precision and elegance, like a fine symphony, no?" "I'd rather a hot breakfast," Hastings muttered. "Ah, but first, an experiment." They were soon outside in the garden maze, Poirot leading the way along the frozen gravel path that snaked through the sculpted hedges. Hastings followed, watching as Poirot studied the ground with exaggerated care. "You think the murderer passed through here?" "Not merely passed through," Poirot said, pausing before a small clearing at the heart of the maze. "They used the maze. Observe. In the centre of the clearing was a stone pedestal. It sat a frost-covered bird-bath, beneath which a faint indentation remained in the snow, one shaped unmistakably like a shallow box." "The hiding place," Poirot said softly. "The original Grenfell manuscript." Hastings blinked. "Here? But how did you know?" Poirot tapped his forehead. "Logic, mon ami. Montrose was careful. He wanted to preserve the proof of his theft, but keep it distant enough to retrieve, if needed. Where better than a cold, little visited corner of the estate that only someone intimately familiar with the property would think to use? You think Montrose hid it here, and someone else retrieved it. Just so." Poirot crouched beside the pedestal, but note, the snow shows two distinct footprints, one with a pronounced left heel, the other lighter, more delicate, smaller. Hastings's brows lifted. "Two people came here." "No. One person, twice. Once before the snow, once after." Poirot stood and turned toward the winding path. It was Lady Deverell who found the manuscript. "What? The hostess? Why would she?" "Revenge," Poirot said quietly. "She knew Montrose had stolen from her brother. When she discovered the score hidden here, the truth struck her with cold clarity." They made their way back to the house, Poirot silent in thought. As they entered the drawing-room, they found Lady Deverell standing at the window, staring into the snow-laden trees. "Lady Deverell," Poirot said softly. She turned, startled. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't hear you come in." He bowed slightly. "Forgive me for intruding, but I believe we must speak plainly now." Her lips tightened. About Felix. About your brother, Adrian Grenfell. She blinked. I don't, no, need to deny it. I know he was your brother. You spoke of him once, long ago, when we met in Paris. At the time it seemed an idle comment, but when I saw the initials carved into the violin case, A.G., I remembered. Her face paled. You knew Montrose had stolen Adrian's work. When he died, you buried the truth. Perhaps you hoped Montrose would atone in time. But when he published the stolen score as his own, when he refused to acknowledge Adrian, it became too much. Tears glistened in her eyes. He ruined him. Adrian was brilliant, fragile, full of dreams. Montrose took them all. And when Adrian died in obscurity, penniless, Felix stood triumphant. I invited him here to confront him, but I never meant. Poirot waited. I found the manuscript in the garden, she whispered. I knew he'd hidden it. I waited until he went to the conservatory and followed him. He was already volatile, angry. He knew I'd guessed. He mocked me. Her voice trembled. I confronted him. I told him I would reveal the truth. He laughed, said no one would believe a grieving sister of a forgotten amateur. He dared me to try. I lost control. She collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing softly. Poirot remained silent, allowing her grief its course. At last she looked up. I didn't plan it, I swear. I only meant to force him to confess. You struck him with the violin, didn't you? She nodded. He grabbed me. I reached for it. It was nearby on a chair. I didn't think. It happened so fast. Then he collapsed, and I panicked. You took the violin to protect myself, to hide the weapon. I didn't want anyone to suspect. I thought if the murder looked like a theft. Poirot sat across from her, hands folded. Lady Deverell, it is not my place to judge. But I must tell the truth. I understand, she whispered. A moment passed in silence. Hastings stepped forward. But what about Coombs and Brant? They both tampered with the scene. Indeed, Poirot said. Each acted out of self-interest. Coombs to uncover the forgery. Brant to seize the violin. But neither committed murder. Their trespasses are of a lesser degree. Lady Deverell looked up suddenly. Do you think I'll hang? Poirot looked at her with great sadness. That is not for me to say. But I will speak on your behalf. And I will tell the truth, that you acted in passion, not malice. Lady Deverell nodded slowly. Thank you. Poirot rose. The police will be here soon. Let us wait with dignity. As they left the room, Hastings turned to him. You knew all along, didn't you? Poirot sighed. I suspected. But one does not accuse until the evidence sings, mon ami. And now the melody is clear. They stepped into the corridor just as the sound of a car crunching up the snowy drive echoed through the house. The final act had begun. Chapter 6. The Final Allegro. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Poirot, standing at the window, watched the light drizzle turn into snow, obscuring the world outside with a pale veil. Hastings, ever impatient, paced beside him, his thoughts restless as he processed the turn of events. Poirot, he began, his voice strained, are you sure about Lady Deverell? She seemed so vulnerable, so remorseful. Are we certain she's the one who killed Montrose?" Poirot turned to face him, his sharp gaze fixed on his companion. "Hastings, we must not allow emotions to cloud our judgment. I too saw her grief and regret. But, as I have said before, the facts speak louder than any emotion." "But we have a confession," Hastings replied, raising his hands in exasperation. She admitted to confronting Montrose with the violin, to striking him in the heat of anger. Poirot's lips twitched upward, but there was no humour in his expression. "Yes, indeed, but confessing to the crime does not always equate to guilt. We must not rush to conclusions. There are still questions left unanswered." "Such as?" Hastings asked, his brow furrowing. "Lady Deverell's statement is incomplete. She admits to striking Montrose in the heat of the moment, but that does not explain the strangulation marks on his neck. She was not capable of causing those injuries with a mere violin." Hastings blinked. "You think someone else was involved?" "Exactly," Poirot replied. "The violin was indeed a weapon, but it was not the cause of Montrose's death. There was something far more sinister at play, mon ami." "But who could have done it? And why?" Poirot gave Hastings a small, knowing smile. "That is precisely what we must determine, and I believe we are nearing the final notes of this puzzle." The sound of a car approaching in the distance interrupted their conversation. Poirot looked out the window once more and watched as the police car pulled up the long driveway. Inspector Mallory, a tall, imposing figure, stepped out and approached the front door, his coat flapping in the wind. "Now, let us see how the final act unfolds," Poirot murmured. A short while later, the inspector was seated across from Poirot and Hastings in the drawing-room. His large frame seemed to fill the space, and his stern expression gave little away. "You called for us, Poirot?" Mallory asked, his voice steady. "Indeed, Inspector," Poirot replied. "I believe the time has come to reveal the truth of Montrose's death." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "We already know he was murdered. Lady Deverell has confessed, hasn't she?" Poirot nodded. "She has confessed to striking him with the violin. Yes, but the true cause of death lies elsewhere." Mallory leaned forward, intrigued. "You're saying Lady Deverell didn't kill him?" "Correct," Poirot said calmly. "I have reason to believe that the murder was committed by someone else. Someone who sought to cover their tracks and frame Lady Deverell." "Someone else?" Mallory echoed, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. "But she admitted to the crime. She was the one who found him dead, wasn't she?" Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Yes, but that is precisely the problem. You see, Lady Deverell could not have caused the strangulation marks on Montrose's neck. The marks indicate that the killer used a particular type of cord, something slender and strong enough to inflict such damage. A violin string, for example." Hastings looked up, his mind racing. "Wait a minute. Are you saying someone took a violin string and strangled him?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly. And there was only one person in the house who had access to the violin strings. Coombs, the butler." Mallory's expression hardened. "Coombs, the butler? But why would he do such a thing?" Poirot stepped closer, his voice lowering as he spoke. "The motive, Inspector, lies in Montrose's blackmail. You see, Coombs was well aware of Montrose's plan to expose the stolen manuscript. He had been helping Montrose for some time, thinking that they would share the spoils. But Montrose had no intention of sharing. He was using Coombes, just as he had used Adrian Grenfell. Coombes must have realized that Montrose had no intention of splitting the reward for the manuscript's return. Poirot continued, and when he saw that Lady Deverell was about to expose Montrose, he decided to act. He killed Montrose in order to prevent the truth from coming to light. And in his haste, he framed Lady Deverell by placing the violin in the room, making it appear as though she had struck him in anger. Mallory's eyes narrowed. But why take the risk of killing Montrose so publicly? He could have gotten away with blackmailing him quietly. Poirot's eyes gleamed with insight. Coombes was not as clever as he thought. He overestimated his ability to control the situation. By staging the scene, he hoped to make Lady Deverell appear guilty, but he made one crucial mistake. He didn't account for the fact that someone with an eye for detail, someone like myself, would eventually unravel the truth. Mallory exhaled sharply. "You're sure about this?" "I am," Poirot said simply. "And now I believe we have enough evidence to bring the culprit to justice." A short while later, Poirot, Hastings, and Inspector Mallory were standing in the hallway outside Lady Deverell's drawing-room. Coombes had been taken into custody, and Lady Deverell had been informed that she was no longer a suspect. She looked both relieved and exhausted as she stood by the fireplace. "Lady Deverell," Poirot said gently, "I must apologize for the confusion earlier. The truth has come to light, and you are no longer in danger." She nodded, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I never meant for any of this to happen." "You acted out of emotion," Poirot said kindly, "and I do not believe you intended harm. The past is behind you now." As Poirot turned to leave, he glanced at the violin resting on the mantelpiece, now silent at last. The puzzle had been solved, but there was still an air of melancholy hanging in the room, a reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect homes, secrets and shadows often lurked beneath the surface. The case of the silent violin was closed, but for Poirot it was merely the end of one symphony and the beginning of the next. Chapter 7. The tuning of truth. The snow continued to fall steadily, now blanketing the estate in an almost eerie silence. The guests had mostly dispersed, leaving only a few, including the ever-vigilant Poirot and his loyal friend Hastings. The house, once brimming with life, now felt like an abandoned mausoleum, its halls echoing with the memories of the night's tragic events. Hastings, who had spent much of the morning and early afternoon discussing the case with Poirot, now stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. He was lost in thought, pondering how Coombes, the seemingly trustworthy butler, had gone unnoticed. "For so long, Poirot," Hastings said suddenly, breaking the silence. "How did you come to suspect Coombes? I thought the butler was always the last person one would suspect." Poirot, who had been quietly contemplating a cup of tea, set it down and looked up at his companion. "Ah, Hastings, you have touched on an important point. It is true that in many cases the butler is assumed to be above suspicion. After all, he is often the one who seems most loyal, most proper. But that very propriety is often the mask that hides the true nature of the person beneath." Hastings frowned. "So it was his behaviour that tipped you off?" Partially, Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming with thought. But more than that, it was his proximity to the victim. Coombes had been with Montrose for many years, but despite their long association, he never seemed entirely at ease. There was always a sense of tension when he was around Montrose, like a thread stretched too thin, ready to snap. Hastings nodded, slowly, remembering the moments when Coombes had been present during their investigations. "So, you think it was the blackmail?" "Exactly," Poirot interrupted. "Coombes knew that Montrose had something on him, something that could ruin his life. And Coombes was clever enough to recognize that the return of the manuscript would only be the beginning. If Montrose had his way, Coombes would never see a penny of the reward. The butler's actions were motivated by greed and fear, the very combination that leads to betrayal." Hastings sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "But Poirot, what about Lady Deverell? She seemed so convinced she had killed Montrose. How do you explain her confession?" Poirot's gaze softened as he leaned back in his chair. "Ah, Hastings, human nature is often the most perplexing part of any investigation. Lady Deverell's confession was genuine, but not in the way it appeared. You see, she had confronted Montrose, yes, and in the heat of the moment she had struck him with the violin. But that was not what killed him. But she said she was holding the violin when he fell," Hastings pointed out. "Indeed, and she was. But she was not the one who caused the fatal injury." Poirot paused, letting his words sink in. Coombes had already strangled Montrose by the time Lady Deverell arrived. He knew she was expected, and he knew that if he didn't act quickly, the truth would come to light. In a panic, he staged the scene to make it look as though she had murdered him. Hastings' eyes widened. So she was a victim of circumstance, a pawn in Coombes's twisted plan? "Precisely," Poirot said, nodding. "She was distraught, and in her emotional state she misinterpreted the situation. When she found Montrose, she believed she had been the one to kill him. It was only later, after I examined the evidence more closely, that I realized the truth." A moment of silence passed between them. The storm outside had intensified, and the wind howled against the windows. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. Suddenly, Poirot stood, his face alight with the thrill of discovery. "Hastings, there is one more part of this puzzle that has been overlooked, an important detail that no one else has noticed. I must return to the scene of the crime." Hastings stood startled. "Back to the library? But Poirot, the case is solved. Coombes has confessed. He's in custody." "Ah, Hastings, the confession is a piece of the puzzle, but not the final one. There is something still amiss, something that Coombes failed to account for in his haste." Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. "Come, we must go to the library." The library was as they had left it, dimly lit, with the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air. Poirot moved to the centre of the room, his sharp eyes scanning every inch, taking in details that others might overlook. Hastings followed, closely behind, his curiosity piqued. Poirot crouched by the spot where Montrose had been found. He ran his fingers gently along the edge of the desk, his mind working as he muttered to himself. "You see, Hastings, there is something curious about this room. When Montrose was discovered, The violin was placed on the floor next to him, but there was no sign of a struggle, no marks to suggest he had fought with his attacker. And yet he was strangled quite thoroughly. Hastings frowned. "You're saying that Montrose didn't even try to fight back?" "Exactly," Poirot replied. "A man who is in a fight for his life would have made an effort to defend himself. Yet Montrose's hands were not raised in defence. He was not resisting. And that tells me something crucial." Poirot stood up and turned toward Hastings. "What do you think would happen if someone were to approach Montrose from behind? Someone he trusted, someone who would not raise suspicion." Hastings's eyes widened. He wouldn't resist. He'd have trusted the attacker not to harm him. "Precisely," Poirot said. "That was the key. Coombs did not kill Montrose in a fit of rage. No, he killed him with cold, calculated precision. He knew Montrose well enough to approach him from behind and strangle him without raising alarm." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward the desk. And then, to ensure no one would suspect him, Coombs took the violin and placed it next to the body, hoping it would create the illusion of a crime of passion. He then manipulated Lady Deverell into believing she had killed Montrose, knowing that her emotional state would make her more likely to confess. Hastings stared at Poirot in amazement. So Coombs orchestrated everything. He was clever enough to manipulate every detail. Poirot nodded slowly. "Clever, yes, but not clever enough to fool me." Just then the door opened, and Inspector Mallory entered the room, his face grim. "Poirot, we've been through the evidence again. Coombs insists that he killed Montrose in a fit of rage, but he's lying. We now know the full story, and he's going to pay for his crimes." Poirot turned toward Mallory, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Indeed, Inspector, and it is only a matter of time before justice is done. But remember, the truth always finds a way to make itself known, even when it's hidden behind a carefully crafted lie." Chapter 8. The Final Melody. The storm had not abated since the night of Montrose's death. If anything, it had intensified, casting a shadow over the estate. The snow fell heavier now, thick and fast, as though trying to smother the truth beneath its blanket. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, as Hercule Poirot, Hastings, and Inspector Mallory gathered in the study for the final part of their investigation. "Poirot, you've uncovered the truth," Mallory said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Coombs has confessed, and we've gathered enough evidence to convict him. But there's something I don't understand. Why did he go to such lengths to frame Lady Deverell? What was the ultimate motivation?" Poirot leaned forward, steepling his fingers together, as he often did when deep in thought. "Ah, Inspector, you see, the why is often the most elusive part of the puzzle. People commit crimes for many reasons, but they do so with the belief that they can escape justice. Coombs, in this case, believed that by staging the crime and manipulating the situation, he would not only save himself from suspicion, but also eliminate the threat posed by Montrose's knowledge of his past. But Montrose was just a man with a manuscript, Hastings said. A man who could have exposed Coombs's secret, yes, but why go so far as to kill him? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Ah, Hastings, that is where the violin comes in. The manuscript, yes, it was valuable, But it was not the key to understanding Coombes's motive. The violin, on the other hand, is the answer. How so? Mallory asked, leaning in. Poirot turned to Mallory. The violin, as I have observed, was Montrose's prized possession, a relic, if you will, of his youth and his identity. Coombes, knowing this, knew that Montrose had threatened to sell the violin if his blackmail demands were not met. Montrose had also promised to reveal Coombes's sordid past to the world. The violin would have been sold off as part of the deal. Why would that matter so much? Hastings asked. What difference would the violin make? Ah, the difference is in what Montrose's possession represented, Poirot explained. You see, the violin was not just an object to Montrose. It was a symbol of his power over people. It had a personal connection to his father, and in his eyes it made him irreplaceable, someone who could not be easily threatened. The mere suggestion of selling it was a fate worse than death for him. And for Coombes, it represented the final nail in his coffin. Mallory's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. Coombes must have known that the violin was the key, too, holding Montrose in his grip. If Montrose could ruin him by selling it, Coombes would lose everything. Exactly, Poirot said. Coombes feared that without Montrose's control, he would have nothing left. His career, his reputation, his standing in society would all crumble. The blackmail was not merely financial. It was a matter of survival for Coombes. He knew that Montrose was ruthless enough to take everything from him, including the violin. Hastings looked between the two men. So, Coombes killed Montrose to stop him from selling the violin. But why frame Lady Deverell? Why not just get rid of the manuscript and leave it at that? Poirot smiled, a small, knowing smile. Ah, that, my dear Hastings, is the genius of Coombes's plan. If Lady Deverell had been suspected of murder, all eyes would be on her, and Coombes would remain in the shadows. He could pretend to be a mere servant caught up in a tragic situation. By framing her, Coombes bought himself time, and most importantly, he ensured that the manuscript would not be found before he had a chance to destroy it. Mallory nodded slowly, clearly impressed. You think the manuscript is still out there? Certainly, Poirot replied, and that, my friend, is where our investigation must lead next. The room fell silent for a moment. The tension hung thick in the air. Poirot stood up suddenly, his eyes sharp as he turned to Mallory. Inspector, you must search the estate one final time. The manuscript is not in Coombes's possession, but it may very well be hidden where Montrose believed it was safest. Close to him, somewhere where it could be kept away from prying eyes. Mallory looked at Poirot, his expression a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Where do you suggest we look? Poirot smiled mysteriously. In the most obvious of places, Inspector, in plain sight. Later that evening, as Poirot, Hastings and Mallory made their way through the darkened hallways of the estate, a sense of anticipation filled the air. They had searched every corner of the estate, but something told Poirot that they had overlooked the most important place of all. I do not think we have been thorough enough, Poirot murmured, as they approached the grand piano in the corner of the sitting room. Mallory raised an eyebrow. The piano? Surely not. Poirot didn't answer, instead making his way over to the instrument. He ran his fingers lightly over the polished surface, his gaze fixed on the keys. Ah, Hastings, what does one do with something precious, something that must be hidden yet protected? One keeps it within arm's reach, always within view, but never suspected. Hastings furrowed his brow. You think the manuscript is inside? The piano? Exactly, Poirot said, stepping closer. This piano, it is Montrose's most cherished possession. And what better place to hide something that must remain undetected? Poirot lifted the lid of the piano slowly, revealing the interior. His eyes scanned the strings and hammers, and then, with a sharp intake of breath, he reached inside. A moment later, he pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was the manuscript. Mon Dieu, Mallory muttered. How did we miss this? Poirot smiled. It is always the most obvious places, Inspector. When you are looking for something, you often overlook the simplest solution. Hastings stared at the manuscript, his mind racing. But what now? What will happen to it? Poirot's expression became sombre. Now, my dear Hastings, we make sure the truth is revealed. The manuscript shall be returned to its rightful place, where it can no longer be used for blackmail or deceit. As they made their way back to the drawing-room, the storm outside seemed to subside, the wind no longer howling with such intensity. The estate, once fraught with tension and suspicion, now seemed to breathe a little easier. Coombs was in custody, and the manuscript had been recovered. The mystery that had haunted the estate was at last drawing to a close. Poirot paused before the door, turning to face Hastings and Mallory. It is not just the solution of the mystery that matters, he said quietly, but the lessons we learn along the way. The deceit, the lies, the manipulation, these things can only survive as long as we allow them to. The truth, however, always finds a way to surface. With that, he opened the door, and the three men stepped into the room, ready to close the final chapter of the mystery that had unfolded at the snowbound estate. Chapter 9. The final curtany. Snowstorm had finally dissipated, leaving behind a quiet that seemed to echo in the once bustling corridors of the estate. The estate, now free of its previous cloud of suspicion, stood silent under the grey sky. But Hercule Poirot, Inspector Mallory, and Captain Hastings knew that their work was far from finished. The discovery of the manuscript had been the final piece in the puzzle, but there was still the matter of ensuring that justice was served. Coombs, though caught red-handed in the crime, was still a man who had orchestrated a carefully calculated plan. It was a plan so full of twists and deception that Poirot had been certain it would take him some time to unravel. But now, with the manuscript recovered and Coombs's confession secured, the final pieces of the mystery were beginning to fall into place. "We are close now," Poirot said, his voice calm as they sat in the drawing-room, the fire crackling in the hearth before them. He had been unusually quiet since the manuscript had been discovered. "But we must still answer the question of why Coombs went to such great lengths to frame Lady Deverell. Why not simply let Montrose's blackmail stand?" Mallory shook his head, still baffled by the complexity of the situation. "That's what I don't understand. Poirot, why bring Lady Deverell into this at all?" Poirot steepled his fingers and stared into the fire, his thoughts focused. "Ah, you see, Inspector, that was not a simple act of framing. No, it was far more calculated. Coombs needed someone to bear the blame." If Lady Deverell had been convicted, all suspicion would have fallen on her, and Coombs could remain in the background, posing as an innocent bystander. But why her? Hastings asked, leaning forward. There were other people who might have been more suspicious. The other servants, perhaps. Poirot's gaze shifted to Hastings, his eyes sharp. Because, my friend, Lady Deverell was far more than just a pawn in this game. She was the ultimate diversion. Coombs needed to hide his true involvement in Montrose's death, and by involving Lady Deverell, he created a smokescreen, a way to mislead us all. Hastings paused for a moment, digesting Poirot's words. But if Coombs was the killer, and we know that, why did he think he could get away with it for so long? Because, Poirot replied, he underestimated the power of observation. He thought that by creating an elaborate scene of chaos and confusion, he could confuse those investigating the case. But he made a mistake, Inspector. He overlooked one very important detail. Mallory furrowed his brow. What detail? The violin, Poirot said softly. Montrose's violin. Coombs did not understand the significance of it. The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Mallory looked from Poirot to Hastings, his expression one of confusion. What do you mean? Poirot smiled faintly, as though he had been waiting for the right moment to explain. You see, the violin was not just a symbol of Montrose's personal connection to his father. It was a symbol of his own pride and power. And Montrose, in his arrogance, thought that the violin would be his leverage over Coombs. But Coombs knew better. He knew that Montrose would never part with it willingly, so he used the violin as the key to his own manipulation. Hastings leaned forward. So, you're saying Coombs killed Montrose because he was trying to take back his power? Exactly, Hastings, Poirot replied. The violin was not just a piece of furniture to Montrose. It was his claim to significance. Coombs understood that better than anyone. Montrose had tried to exploit him, to force him into submission. But Coombs was no fool. He knew that he would never be free until Montrose was dead. Mallory absorbed Poirot's words in silence, his eyes narrowing as he processed the full weight of the truth. So, you're saying Coombs killed Montrose for the violin, and then framed Lady Deverell to cover his tracks? Yes, Poirot said, and he did it so expertly that even now, after all our investigation, it seems almost impossible to untangle the web he spun. The conversation shifted then, and Mallory seemed to grow more and more resolute in his determination to see the case through to its conclusion. So where does that leave us now, Poirot? What's the next step? Poirot stood up, his expression shifting from contemplation to action. Now, Inspector, we must make certain that Coombs is held accountable for his actions. We have all the evidence we need, but there is one last piece that must be resolved before we can close this case. And what piece is that? Hastings asked. Poirot looked directly at Mallory. The matter of the violin. It must be returned to its rightful place, Lady Deverell's possession. She must be absolved of her involvement in the crime. Mallory's eyes widened. You're suggesting we give the violin back to her? Poirot nodded, his eyes steady. Yes, it was hers to begin with, and it was only through Coombs's machinations that it was taken away from her. The violin represents much more than just an object. It is a symbol of her father's legacy. It must be restored to her, for justice to truly be served. There was a pause, and then Mallory, though clearly reluctant, agreed. Very well. I'll arrange for the transfer of the violin to Lady Deverell. But it still leaves the matter of Coombs. Poirot turned to Mallory. Do not worry, Inspector. Coombs will face justice. His confession is solid, and with the manuscript recovered, there is no escape for him. The three men sat back, contemplating the resolution that was now in sight. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that the threads of this complex puzzle had finally been woven together. Justice would be served. Coombs would face his reckoning, and Lady Deverell would finally be free of the shadow that had hung over her. Later that evening, Poirot sat alone by the fire, his thoughts turning over the details of the case once more. It had been a long journey, illed with false trails, clever misdirections, and careful observation. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. The manuscript was no longer a tool for blackmail. The violin had been returned to Lady Deverell, and Coombs had been arrested for his crimes. As Poirot gazed into the flames, he could not help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had solved the case, as he always did. But there was something more, something that only he could understand about the satisfaction of seeing justice done, of seeing the innocent cleared and the guilty held to account. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he rose to answer it. Mallory stood there, holding a small envelope. Poirot, it's done. Coombs has been taken into custody, and Lady Deverell is free to resume her life. The case is closed. Poirot smiled, his eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. Thank you, Inspector. The puzzle has been solved, and once again, justice has been served. As Mallory turned to leave, Poirot gazed once more into the fire. The case of the silent violin had come to its conclusion, and once again Hercule Poirot had proven that no mystery, no matter how complex, could escape the sharpness of his mind. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. The morning after Coombs's arrest, the Dathum estate was as still as a frozen lake. The storm had long passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that shimmered under the pale light of dawn. The quiet, however, was not without its weight. The tension that had hung in the air like a spectre was finally gone. But there was something oddly unsettling about the peaceful calm that had replaced it. Inside the drawing-room, Hercule Poirot sat with his usual poise, his eyes narrowing as he watched the flames dance in the hearth. The case was over. Coombs had confessed to his crimes. The manuscript had been returned to Lady Deverell, and the violin had been restored to its rightful owner. Justice had been done. But Poirot knew that there was always more to a case than just solving the mystery. There was always more to understand. Captain Hastings, as was his custom, sat across from him, flipping through the morning papers with a distracted air. Inspector Mallory, though visibly relieved, still carried a certain weariness about him. They had all worked tirelessly to bring the case to a close, but there was something in the air that hinted at an unspoken truth still lingering. Poirot's voice broke the silence. You know, my friends, there is more to this than the simple unravelling of the mystery. Hastings looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean, Poirot? Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp, The truth, mon ami, is not merely about who committed the crime, or how it was done. It is about the consequences, the lives affected, and the human nature that drives people to such lengths. Coombes killed Montrose, yes, but it was not for money, nor for revenge. It was for something much deeper, something that no one could have predicted. Mallory looked at Poirot with interest. "What do you mean, Poirot? Surely the motive was clear. The violin, the blackmail, everything pointed to that." Poirot smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Ah, but the violin! Yes, the violin was the catalyst. But the true motive, I believe, lay in something else. It was not the object itself, but what it represented. The violin was a symbol of Montrose's legacy. Coombes, a man so deeply consumed with jealousy and bitterness, could not bear to watch Montrose live with that legacy unchallenged. The violin was not just an object to him. It was the embodiment of Montrose's arrogance and entitlement." Mallory sat up straighter, his interest piqued. "So you're saying Coombes killed Montrose because he couldn't stand to see him continue with that legacy?" "Precisely," Poirot replied, his voice growing more intense. "Coombes may have been a man of intellect, but his mind was consumed by a deep-seated need for control. Montrose had something that Coombes could never have, a legacy, a place of importance. That violin was not just the key to his power, it was a symbol that Coombes would never be able to achieve, and in his twisted reasoning, he decided that killing Montrose and framing Lady Deverell was the only way to rid himself of that reminder." Hastings nodded slowly, his mind racing as he processed Poirot's words. "But what of Lady Deverell? She was innocent. Surely you don't mean to say she was part of Coombes's plan?" Poirot's eyes softened as he regarded Hastings. "No, no, mon ami. Lady Deverell was not part of the plot. She was, as we know, a victim of Coombes's manipulations. She was not the intended target. But Coombes, with his cunning, needed a scapegoat. Someone whose reputation could be ruined. Someone who would divert suspicion away from him. Then why did Coombes choose her?" Mallory asked, his voice steady, but still full of curiosity. Poirot's fingers danced in the air as he explained. Lady Deverell was the perfect distraction. She had the status, the connection to Montrose, and the appearance of being too close to him. Her position as Montrose's former lover made her the ideal candidate for a smear campaign. Coombes knew that with Lady Deverell implicated, all eyes would be diverted from him. He thought his involvement would go unnoticed. Hastings shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering between Poirot and Mallory. "It's a clever plan, Poirot, but it was also terribly risky. How did Coombes think he could pull it off?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile. "Because he relied too much on his own cleverness. He thought the tangled web of lies and deceit would be enough to conceal his involvement. He underestimated one thing, however. He underestimated the power of observation. The small details that seemed insignificant to him were the very things that would unravel the truth." Mallory leaned back, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "So, in the end, it all came down to those small details. The manuscript, the violin, the way Coombes tried to manipulate everything. If not for those things, Coombes might have gotten away with it." "Ah, yes," Poirot agreed. "It is always the small things that reveal the truth. The manuscript was key, but without the violin, without the subtle clues hidden in Montrose's world, it would have been impossible to expose the full extent of Coombes's scheme. The room fell silent again as the full weight of Poirot's words settled over them. The pieces of the puzzle had been laid out in front of them, and the case was as close to closure as it could be. But the implications of the crime, the motivations behind it, and the twisted desires of Coombes still lingered in the air like an unresolved chord. Poirot stood and walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the still landscape outside. The Chiers estate, once a place of opulence and grandeur, now stood as a quiet monument to a tragedy that had nearly consumed it. The snow had stopped falling, but the ghosts of the past seemed to linger in the cold air. "Justice has been served, Poirot," said, his voice distant, "but the consequences of this crime will not be easily forgotten. Coombes is gone, but the damage he has done is lasting. Lady Deverell will recover, of course, but she, too, will carry the weight of what has happened. And as for Montrose, his legacy will forever be tied to this dark chapter." Mallory looked at Poirot, his expression sombre. "I suppose that's the way of things, Poirot. Justice may be served, but it's never as simple as it seems." Poirot nodded slowly. "No, mon ami, it is never as simple as it seems. But we move forward, and we learn from what has happened. The world is a complicated place, full of secrets and lies, but that is why I do what I do. I unravel the knots and I find the truth." Hastings smiled, though it was a melancholy expression. "I have to admit, Poirot, you've done it again. Another case solved, and another mystery laid to rest." Poirot's eyes twinkled, though his smile remained small. "Ah, but remember, my friend, the puzzle is never truly solved. There is always another mystery waiting, another case to be unravelled. That is the nature of my work." As the three men stood there, contemplating the resolution of the case, they understood that life would go on. The estate would continue to stand, the snow would eventually melt, and time would move forward. But the events that had unfolded over the past few days would remain etched in their memories, a reminder of the complexities of human nature, the dangers of pride and jealousy, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. With a final glance at the estate, Poirot turned away. The case of the silent violin had come to its conclusion, but Hercule Poirot knew that in this world there was always more to discover.